What if the prison destroying your peace was never around you, but inside you, not made of walls, but made of thoughts? Thoughts you repeated for so many years that they slowly became your reality. Think about it carefully. How many times has your mind made you suffer over things that never even happened? How many nights have you lost to overthinking, imagined conversations, future fears, old memories that should have disappeared long ago? Your body sits safely in one place, but your mind keeps dragging you through invisible worlds filled with fear, anxiety, regret, and emotional noise. And after enough time, you stop questioning it. You call it stress. You call it personality. You call it, "This is just who I am." But the Vedas warned humanity about this thousands of years ago. They believed the human mind can build an illusion so powerful that people spend their entire lives trapped inside it without ever realizing the prison exists. Because the most dangerous prison is not the one you can see. It is the one that changes the way you see everything. The way you see yourself, the way you see life, the way you see reality itself. And the most terrifying part is this: the prison does not feel painful in the beginning. It feels familiar. It feels like your thoughts, your identity, your fears, your story. But tonight, you may begin noticing something most people never see. The voice inside your head may not actually be telling you the truth. It may only be repeating the illusion your mind built around you for your entire life. Your mind secretly replaced reality with a world of its own. Most people move through life believing they are seeing reality clearly, exactly as it is. They trust their thoughts automatically. They trust their emotional reactions automatically. They trust the voice inside their head without ever questioning where it came from or why it speaks the way it does. But the Vedas taught something deeply unsettling thousands of years ago. They taught that human beings rarely experience reality directly. Instead, they experience mental interpretations layered over reality every second of the day. In simple words, your mind is constantly creating a version of reality inside your head, and after enough time, you stop noticing the difference between what is actually happening and what your mind is telling you is happening. This is why two people can go through the exact same situation and experience it completely differently. One person sees rejection, another sees misunderstanding. One person sees failure, another sees growth. One person sees danger everywhere, another remains calm in the same moment. The external event may be the same, but the internal world changes everything. And most people never realize how much of their suffering is being created internally. Think about how often your mind changes your emotional state without anything truly happening outside. Someone replies to your message late, and suddenly your mind begins creating stories. Maybe they are angry with me, maybe they are losing interest, maybe I said something wrong. Within minutes, your peace disappears even though nothing has actually been confirmed. Or maybe someone gives you a strange look for 1 second, and your mind starts replaying it the entire day. Why did they look at me like that? Did I embarrass myself? Are they judging me? The situation itself lasted only a moment, but inside your mind, it continues living for hours. This is how the prison slowly forms, not through physical chains, but through unconscious mental storytelling. The mind does not simply observe reality, it edits reality, it colors reality, it reshapes reality based on fear, memory, insecurity, desire, and emotional conditioning. And after years of this, people stop seeing life clearly. They only see the mental version their mind creates for them. The Vedas explained that the uncontrolled mind fears uncertainty more than almost anything else. It cannot relax inside the unknown. So whenever life becomes unclear, the mind quickly fills empty spaces with assumptions. If someone becomes quiet, the mind imagines rejection. If the future becomes uncertain, the mind imagines disaster. If something painful happened once before, the mind expects it to happen again. This happens so automatically that most people never even notice it. They believe the thoughts immediately. And once thoughts are believed repeatedly, they begin shaping emotions, decisions, habits, relationships, and eventually entire lives. A person can sit peacefully inside their room with absolutely no danger around them, yet internally feel overwhelmed by anxiety because the mind keeps creating fearful future scenarios. A person can receive genuine love from others, yet still feel emotionally unloved, because the mind keeps replaying old rejection from the past. A person can achieve success externally, yet internally feel empty because the mind keeps comparing their life to someone else's. The suffering feels real, the emotions feel real, but the deeper source of the suffering often comes from mental interpretation rather than reality itself. This is why the sages warned that the human mind can create invisible prisons more powerful than physical ones. Because physical prisons only trap the body, mental prisons trap perception itself. And once perception becomes trapped, even beautiful moments lose their beauty. You begin expecting disappointment before joy even arrives. You begin distrusting people before they hurt you. You begin imagining failure before taking action. Little by little, the mind trains you to live defensively instead of freely. And the saddest part is this: most people do not even realize it is happening. They think constant overthinking is normal. They think constant worry is intelligence. They think emotional exhaustion is simply part of adulthood. But the Vedas taught that this endless inner noise is not the natural state of human consciousness. It is conditioning. It is the result of a mind left completely unchecked for years. The more unconscious the mind becomes, the more powerful its illusions appear. Eventually, the mental world becomes stronger than reality itself. People begin reacting more to imagined situations than real ones. They suffer from conversations that never happened. They fear outcomes that never arrive. They replay painful memories so often that the past begins controlling the present. And after enough years, the prison becomes invisible. Because when you live inside the same mental patterns long enough, they stop feeling like patterns. They begin feeling like personality. You no longer say, "My mind creates fear." You say, "This is just who I am." You no longer say, "My thoughts are exhausting me." You say, "This is just how life feels." And that is the most dangerous stage of all. Because once the prison feels normal, people stop trying to leave it. They decorate it. They defend it. They build their identity inside it, without realizing that beyond all the mental noise, beyond all the fear, beyond all the overthinking, there may still exist a peaceful awareness quietly waiting beneath it all. The most dangerous prison is the one you call myself. One of the deepest illusions ever created by the human mind is the idea of identity. From the moment you entered this world, people slowly began telling you who you are. You were given a name, a background, a personality, a role to play, a story to carry. Little by little, you started collecting labels and attaching them to yourself. I am shy. I am emotional. I am broken. I am successful. I am unlovable. I am stronger than others. I am a failure. I am the victim. I am the hero. And after enough repetition, these labels stopped feeling temporary. They started feeling real. But the Vedas asked a question so powerful that most people avoid thinking about it completely. Who are you before all these labels? Because if you look carefully, everything you call myself has been changing your entire life. Your body changed, your thoughts changed, your opinions changed, your dreams changed, your fears changed. Even your personality changed many times over the years. The version of you that existed at 10 years old is not the same version existing today, yet something inside you remained present through every stage. Something watched the child become an adult. Something silently witnessed every heartbreak, every embarrassment, every success, every fear, every emotional storm. That silent awareness remained there the entire time. The Vedas taught that this awareness is your deeper nature, not the temporary character created by the mind. But most people never discover this, because the mind becomes so loud, so emotionally convincing, that people begin confusing the character with the self. And once that happens, the prison becomes invisible, because now you are no longer simply experiencing emotions. You become emotionally identified with them. You do not say, "Fear is appearing inside me." You say, "I am a fearful person." You do not say, Pain passed through my life. You say, I am broken. This changes everything. Because once suffering becomes identity, people unconsciously hold on to it, even when healing becomes possible. This is why many people continue repeating the same emotional cycles for years, the same toxic relationships, the same insecurities, the same destructive habits, the same self-hatred, the same emotional patterns, not because they consciously want pain, but because the ego becomes attached to familiar identity. The false self begins whispering, if I let go of this pain, who will I become? And that question terrifies the mind, because the ego survives through attachment. Attachment to stories, attachment to memories, attachment to emotional roles. Some people become attached to being the misunderstood one. Some become attached to being the strong one who never cries. Some become attached to being the victim of life. Some become attached to appearing perfect in front of others, while secretly suffering inside. The ego builds these identities carefully over time. Then it protects them at all costs, even if they destroy inner peace. This is why people sometimes defend the very things hurting them. A person may stay trapped in emotional pain for years because the pain became part of how they see themselves. A person may continue seeking validation endlessly because their identity depends on approval from others. A person may fear silence because silence begins weakening the false image they spent years protecting. The Vedas warned that the ego creates a psychological mask, then slowly convinces you that the mask is your true face. And once you believe that, life becomes exhausting, because now you must constantly protect an identity that was never stable to begin with. You become afraid of judgment, afraid of rejection, afraid of failure, afraid of looking weak, afraid of losing control, not because your deeper self is threatened, but because the false self constantly fears collapse. This is why criticism hurts people so deeply sometimes. A single opinion from another person can ruin someone's entire day. Why? Because the ego built identity around being accepted. This is why rejection feels unbearable to some people, because the mind quietly attached personal worth to external validation. And slowly, without realizing it, people begin shaping their entire lives around protecting the image they created internally. They stop speaking honestly. They stop expressing vulnerability. They stop taking risks. They stop living naturally. Instead, they become actors trapped inside psychological roles, always performing, always protecting, always trying to maintain the identity the mind created. But the Vedas taught something incredibly liberating. You are not the mask. You are not every fearful thought. You are not every emotional wound. You are not every painful memory. You are not every label society placed on you. Those things exist inside the mind, but awareness itself exists beyond them. And sometimes, in rare quiet moments, people accidentally feel this truth, maybe during deep silence, maybe while watching the ocean, maybe during heartbreak, maybe late at night when the noise finally slows down. For a brief moment, the character disappears, and there is only awareness quietly observing life without struggle, no performance, no identity to defend, no image to maintain, just presence. But most people quickly return to the prison again, because living without the false self feels unfamiliar at first. The ego fears disappearing more than it fears suffering. That is why awakening feels uncomfortable before it feels peaceful, because the prison was never only built from fear. It was built from attachment to the person you believe yourself to be, and the moment you begin questioning that identity honestly, the walls of the prison begin cracking from the inside. Fear quietly designs the limits of your entire life. Fear is one of the most powerful forces controlling the human mind, and the most dangerous part is this. Fear rarely looks dangerous in the beginning. Most of the time, fear looks intelligent. It sounds responsible. It sounds careful. It sounds protective. The voice inside your head says things like, do not trust too much. Do not risk failure. Do not open your heart again. Stay careful. Stay safe. Do not embarrass yourself. Do not step too far outside your comfort zone. And because the voice sounds logical, most people never realize fear is slowly shaping their entire life from the shadows. The Vedas understood something deeply important about human consciousness. Fear does not only protect the body from danger, it also quietly imprisons the soul. Little by little, fear begins building invisible walls around your life. You stop expressing yourself honestly because you fear judgment. You stop chasing dreams because you fear failure. You stop loving deeply because you fear heartbreak. You stop speaking truthfully because you fear rejection. And after enough years, fear slowly transforms a living human being into someone emotionally trapped inside their own mind. The strange thing is this: most people do not even notice when it starts happening. Because fear works gradually, it does not suddenly lock the prison door all at once. It slowly convinces you to build the prison yourself, one fearful decision at a time, one avoided opportunity at a time, one silent compromise at a time, until eventually you are living a much smaller life than the one your soul originally wanted to experience. And yet externally, everything may still appear normal. You may still go to work, still smile around people, still continue daily routines, but internally, something feels restricted. Something feels heavy, because deep down, the soul always knows when it is living in fear instead of freedom. The Vedas taught that fear changes the way people see reality itself. A fearful mind cannot see clearly. It begins expecting danger everywhere. If someone becomes distant for a short time, fear imagines abandonment. If uncertainty appears, fear imagines disaster. If life becomes difficult, fear immediately whispers hopelessness. And over time, people begin reacting not to reality, but to imagined future pain created by the mind. This is why so many human beings suffer from events that never actually happen. The body becomes anxious, the mind becomes restless, sleep disappears, all because fear projected painful futures onto the screen of the mind. And after repeating this pattern for years, people stop questioning it. They simply call it normal stress. But the Vedas warned that constant inner fear disconnects human beings from life itself, because fear makes people emotionally defensive. Instead of fully experiencing life, they begin trying to protect themselves from life. There is a huge difference. A person living freely experiences moments openly, but a fearful person constantly calculates risk emotionally. What if I get hurt? What if I fail? What if people judge me? What if things go wrong? And eventually, fear becomes the hidden architect of their personality. Many people believe they are making free choices, but if they look honestly, fear is making many of those choices for them. Fear chooses silence over truth. Fear chooses comfort over growth. Fear chooses attachment over transformation. Fear chooses familiarity over freedom. This is why people sometimes remain trapped in painful relationships they know are unhealthy. Not because they are happy there, but because fear whispers, "At least this pain is familiar," and familiar pain often feels safer to the mind than unknown freedom. That is how deeply fear can control human behavior. The Vedas explained that fear survives through attachment. The mind becomes attached to control, attached to certainty, attached to predictability, but life itself was never designed to remain completely predictable. Everything changes constantly. People change, relationships change, the body changes, the future changes. Yet the fearful mind resists this reality endlessly. It wants guarantees from life. It wants certainty before action. It wants safety before trust. It wants perfect clarity before movement. But those guarantees rarely come, so fear keeps people frozen between desire and action for years. Some people spend their entire lives waiting to feel completely ready before truly living. And that moment never arrives, because fear always creates another reason to wait, another reason to hesitate, another reason to stay inside the emotional cage. The sages understood something most people never realize until very late in life. Fear does not only steal opportunities, it steals presence. A fearful mind struggles to enjoy the current moment because it is always mentally preparing for future pain. Even beautiful experiences become difficult to fully enjoy. A peaceful day becomes anxiety about tomorrow. A loving moment becomes fear of losing it. Success becomes fear of failure returning, and little by little, Fear drains the ability to experience life deeply. This is why some people have everything externally, yet internally remain restless. Because fear is not always connected to external reality. It lives inside the mind. The Vedas taught that true courage is not the absence of fear. True courage begins when awareness becomes stronger than fear. When a person finally sees fear clearly, instead of automatically obeying it. Because the moment you begin observing fear consciously, something powerful happens. You realize fear is often only a mental projection, a possibility, an imagined future, a story created by the mind. And in that realization, the prison weakens slightly, not because fear disappears instantly, but because awareness finally stops worshipping it. For the first time, you begin seeing that the voice constantly predicting disaster may not actually be truth. It may simply be conditioning, old wounds, old memories, old survival instincts repeating themselves automatically. And once you begin seeing fear clearly, you slowly stop allowing it to design your entire existence. You begin reclaiming parts of yourself, the prison kept hidden for years, your honesty, your openness, your courage, your ability to love, your ability to trust life again. Because beyond fear, there is still a deeper part of you that was never truly trapped, a quieter awareness untouched by the endless panic of the mind. And the moment you reconnect with that awareness, fear no longer feels like a master controlling your life. It becomes only another passing shadow moving through the mind. Desire keeps your soul chasing what never truly satisfies. The human mind is almost never fully still. Even when life becomes calm for a moment, the mind immediately begins searching for the next thing to chase. Another goal, another achievement, another relationship, another source of validation, another emotional high. It keeps whispering the same promise over and over again. Once you finally get this, then you will feel complete. And most people spend their entire lives believing that promise. The Vedas understood something deeply tragic about human suffering. The mind survives through endless craving. It constantly creates the feeling that something is missing from the present moment. Something more is needed. Something better is needed. Some future version of life will finally bring lasting peace. But when that future arrives, peace still does not stay. A person spends years chasing success, then feels empty after achieving it. A person desperately wants love, then enters a relationship and still feels restless inside. A person dreams of wealth, then gains money, but continues feeling emotionally unsatisfied, because the mind immediately creates another desire, another destination, another emotional hunger, and the cycle continues endlessly. The Vedas describe this as one of the deepest prisons of the human experience, not because desire itself is evil, but because unconscious attachment to desire traps awareness in endless movement. The mind never allows itself to rest. It keeps saying, "Not here, not now, not enough yet," and slowly, people lose the ability to experience the present moment fully. Even during beautiful moments, the mind quietly searches for what is missing. Instead of feeling gratitude, it searches for improvement. Instead of feeling peace, it searches for the next emotional stimulation. This is why modern life feels so exhausting for many people. Human beings are constantly mentally running toward imagined future happiness. And because the future never truly arrives permanently, the chasing never ends. The Vedas taught that the mind creates desire because desire keeps the ego alive. As long as the mind is chasing something, it never becomes still enough to question itself. Stillness is dangerous to illusion, because in silence, people may finally realize that peace was never hiding in the future. It was buried underneath endless craving. But the mind fears this realization deeply, because if a person truly became content internally, the entire psychological system built around endless wanting would begin collapsing. This is why society constantly trains people to remain dissatisfied. You are taught to compare yourself endlessly. Compare your appearance, compare your success, compare your relationships, compare your lifestyle, and comparison creates desire automatically. Suddenly what you already have no longer feels enough. The mind begins saying, I need more, I need to become more, I need to prove myself, I need external confirmation that I matter. And without noticing, people become emotionally dependent on chasing. Many people no longer know how to simply exist peacefully without pursuing another form of stimulation. Silence feels uncomfortable, stillness feels empty, because the mind became addicted to movement. The Vedas warned that this endless craving slowly disconnects human beings from their deeper self. A person becomes so focused on gaining external things that they forget to understand their own consciousness, and eventually the soul becomes exhausted, not because life gave too little, but because the mind never stops demanding more. Think about how often desire controls emotional states. A person feels happy after receiving attention, then feels anxious when attention disappears. A person feels valuable after achievement, then feels empty once the excitement fades. A person feels complete after gaining something they wanted, then quickly begins craving something else. This emotional instability happens because peace is being tied to temporary conditions, and temporary conditions always change. The Vedas taught that anything dependent on external conditions cannot create lasting inner freedom, because the external world constantly shifts. Pleasure fades, success changes, people leave, the body ages, situations transform, yet the mind keeps trying to build permanent happiness from temporary experiences, and this creates endless suffering. The strangest part is this: many desires are not even truly your own. They were planted slowly through conditioning. Society tells you what success should look like. Social media tells you what beauty should look like. Culture tells you what kind of life should make you feel important. And after hearing these messages repeatedly, people begin chasing lives they never consciously chose. Some people exhaust themselves trying to impress people they do not even truly care about. Some sacrifice peace just to maintain status. Some spend years chasing validation from strangers while feeling disconnected from themselves internally. The Vedas warned that unconscious desire turns human beings into emotional slaves, because whatever controls your sense of happiness controls you. If your peace depends entirely on external approval, you become imprisoned by other people's opinions. If your happiness depends entirely on achievement, you become trapped in endless pressure. If your worth depends entirely on being desired, you become emotionally controlled by attention. And eventually, the soul begins starving beneath all the external chasing. This is why some people suddenly feel empty even after getting everything they once wanted. Because deep down, the soul was never searching only for external success. It was searching for reconnection. Reconnection with stillness, reconnection with awareness, reconnection with the deeper self hidden beneath endless mental noise. The Vedas taught that true peace does not come from destroying all desire completely. It comes from no longer becoming unconsciously possessed by it. There is a huge difference. A conscious person may still pursue goals, still enjoy life, still experience pleasure, but internally they remain free. Their identity is no longer chained to outcomes. Their happiness is no longer completely dependent on external conditions. They understand that no object, no relationship, no achievement can permanently complete the human soul, because the deepest peace was never something to be gained externally. It was something covered by endless mental craving. And sometimes, in rare quiet moments, people accidentally feel this truth. Maybe while watching the sunset silently, maybe sitting alone late at night, maybe after finally achieving something they chased for years and realizing the emptiness still remained. For a brief moment, the mind becomes quiet enough to notice something deeper, a peaceful awareness already existing beneath the endless wanting, an inner stillness untouched by achievement or failure. And in that moment, people begin realizing something life-changing. The prison was never only built from fear, it was also built from endless desire keeping the soul distracted from itself. The ego would rather suffer than let go of control. One of the most invisible prisons inside the human mind is the ego. And the reason it is so dangerous is because most people do not even realize when the ego is controlling them. They think they are simply protecting themselves, protecting their opinions, protecting their image, protecting their pride. protecting the version of themselves they spent years building. But the Vedas taught that the ego is not your true self. It is a mental identity created slowly through attachment, fear, comparison, memory, and emotional conditioning. The ego is the false character the mind creates and constantly tries to defend. And over time, people become completely trapped inside it. The ego wants to feel important. It wants to feel admired, respected, recognized, superior, needed, desired. It constantly searches for emotional confirmation that it matters. That is why praise feels addictive to the mind, and criticism feels deeply painful. Because the ego builds identity around external validation. A single compliment can make someone feel powerful for hours. A single insult can destroy someone's peace for days. Why? Because the ego becomes emotionally dependent on how others see it, and slowly, without realizing it, people begin living for the image instead of living truthfully. The Vedas warned that the ego does not actually care about peace. It cares about control. It wants control over how people see you, control over outcomes, control over relationships, control over situations, control over identity itself. And whenever control begins slipping away, the ego reacts emotionally. It becomes angry, defensive, jealous, insecure, possessive, fearful, not because your deeper self is threatened, but because the false self fears collapse. This is why human beings often continue suffering long after painful situations already ended. The ego keeps replaying the pain because it cannot accept losing control. Someone leaves your life, and the ego keeps asking, "How could they do this to me?" Someone criticizes you, and the ego keeps replaying the moment repeatedly. Someone succeeds where you failed, and the ego quietly feels threatened internally. The ego constantly compares. It measures worth through status, attention, success, beauty, intelligence, and emotional power. And because comparison never truly ends, the ego remains restless forever. The Vedas understood that the ego survives by constantly separating itself from others. It wants to feel special, different, superior. Even suffering can become part of ego identity. This is one of the deepest truths most people never notice. Some people unconsciously become attached to their pain. They build identity around being the abandoned one, the betrayed one, the misunderstood one, the victim, the emotionally broken person. And after enough years, they no longer know who they are without the suffering. So even when healing becomes possible, the ego resists it because healing threatens the identity built around pain. The false self whispers, "If I let go of this suffering, what remains of me?" And that fear keeps many people emotionally trapped for decades. The ego would often rather continue suffering than disappear. This is why some people repeatedly return to toxic situations they know are destroying them. Not because pain feels good, but because pain became familiar to the identity. The ego chooses familiarity over freedom, even if familiarity hurts. The Vedas explain that the ego creates endless internal conflict because it constantly needs protection. A person attached to being strong fears vulnerability. A person attached to being perfect fears failure. A person attached to being important fears being ignored. A person attached to being successful fears losing status. And eventually, life becomes emotionally exhausting because the ego forces people to constantly maintain an unstable psychological image. They become actors performing identities instead of simply existing naturally. This is why many people feel deeply tired internally, even when nothing physically difficult is happening. The mind never rests. The ego constantly asks, "How am I being perceived? Do people respect me? Am I winning? Am I enough? Am I better than others? Am I losing control?" And this endless mental tension slowly disconnects people from inner peace. The Vedas taught that the deeper self does not need constant validation. Awareness itself does not compete. It does not need applause to exist. It does not become larger through praise or smaller through criticism. But the ego cannot understand this because the ego survives through external reflection. It constantly needs mirrors. That is why social approval becomes addictive. That is why attention becomes emotionally intoxicating. That is why rejection feels unbearable for some people, because the false self depends on outside confirmation to feel real. And modern life strengthens this prison enormously. People compare their entire lives constantly: who looks happier, who appears more successful, who receives more attention, who seems more desired. The ego feeds on comparison endlessly, and the more comparison grows, the further people drift from themselves. The Vedas warned that the ego creates illusion by convincing human beings they are separate from everything else, separate from others, separate from life, separate from existence itself. So people begin living defensively, protecting identity, protecting status, protecting emotional territory. But deep inside, the soul becomes exhausted from all the performance. This is why some people secretly feel relief when they are completely alone. For brief moments, they no longer need to perform an identity for the world. No image to protect, no competition, no emotional mask. Just silence. And in silence, something deeper quietly begins appearing. A version of yourself untouched by social roles, untouched by comparison, untouched by pride and insecurity. The Vedas taught that awakening begins when a person starts observing the ego instead of automatically obeying it. The moment you notice jealousy arising, you are no longer completely trapped inside it. The moment you observe the need for validation, awareness begins separating from the ego. The moment you recognize that your identity is being emotionally controlled by other people's opinions, the prison weakens slightly, because unconsciousness is what gives the ego its power. The ego survives when people never question it, but awareness changes everything. Once you begin seeing the ego clearly, you start noticing how much suffering came from trying to defend an illusion, an image, a role, a psychological mask. And slowly, you begin realizing something life-changing. You were never meant to spend your entire existence protecting a false version of yourself. You were meant to experience life beyond the prison of constant self-defense, beyond comparison, beyond emotional performance, beyond the endless hunger for importance, because beneath the ego, there is still a quieter awareness waiting patiently, a deeper self untouched by praise or blame. And the moment you reconnect with that deeper awareness, the prison built by the ego slowly begins collapsing from within. Your mind keeps reviving the past until it becomes your identity. One of the strangest things about the human mind is that it struggles to let the past truly die. Even when years pass, even when life changes, even when the moment is completely over, the mind continues returning to old memories again and again. Old conversations, old heartbreaks, old betrayals, old embarrassments, old failures, old regrets. And the frightening part is this: the mind does not simply remember the past, it emotionally relives it. A memory appears for only a few seconds, yet suddenly your mood changes completely. Your chest becomes heavy, your thoughts become darker, your energy disappears. Even though the event itself may no longer exist physically, the emotional pain feels alive again inside the mind. The Vedas understood this deeply. They taught that one of the greatest prisons created by the mind is attachment to memory, because the mind keeps resurrecting old pain and carrying it into the present moment. And after enough years, people stop living in reality. They begin living inside psychological echoes of the past. A person who was betrayed once begins expecting betrayal everywhere. A person who was rejected once begins fearing abandonment in every relationship. The person who failed publicly once becomes terrified of trying again. The past slowly becomes the lens through which the mind interprets life. And most people never even notice this happening. They think they are reacting to the present moment, when in reality, they are reacting to emotional memories still living inside them. This is why two people can experience the same situation completely differently. One person enters love openly, another enters love full of fear. One person trusts naturally, Another expects pain before anything even happens. The external reality may be the same, but internally, the past is shaping perception. The Vedas warned that unconscious memory becomes a hidden form of mental conditioning, because every painful experience leaves emotional impressions inside the mind. And if those impressions are never observed consciously, they continue controlling behavior automatically. Without realizing it, people begin organizing their entire lives around avoiding old pain. Some avoid vulnerability because they remember heartbreak. Some avoid opportunities because they remember failure. Some avoid honesty because they remember judgment. Some avoid closeness because they remember abandonment. And slowly, the soul becomes trapped inside survival patterns created by old experiences. This is why many people feel emotionally exhausted, even during peaceful periods of life. The suffering is no longer only coming from reality itself, it is coming from continuous mental repetition. The mind keeps replaying the same emotional movies internally, again and again. Sometimes late at night, sometimes in silence, sometimes during completely unrelated moments. The past suddenly returns. A memory, a voice, a painful moment, a person who left, a mistake you wish never happened, and instantly, the mind pulls you backward emotionally. The Vedas explained that the ego does this because it believes repetition creates protection. The mind thinks, if I replay the pain enough, maybe I can stop it from happening again. But instead of creating freedom, the repetition creates imprisonment. Because the nervous system never fully relaxes, the body keeps carrying emotional tension from events that already ended long ago. This is why some people physically live in the present, but mentally remain trapped in another chapter of their life. Their body moved forward, but their mind stayed behind, and after enough time, people begin building identity around the past itself. You hear it in the way they speak. This is just how I am now. I cannot trust anyone anymore. Life changed me. I will never be the same again. Without realizing it, the pain became part of the self-image. The memory became identity, and once suffering becomes identity, letting go feels terrifying. Because now the mind asks, if I release this pain, who will I become? This is one of the deepest prisons described in the Vedas, not because the past physically trapped you, but because the mind emotionally chained itself to what already ended, and the longer this continues, the heavier life begins feeling internally. Simple moments become difficult to enjoy fully. Peace feels temporary. Happiness feels unsafe, because part of the mind is always waiting for old pain to return. The Vedas taught that this constant attachment to memory slowly disconnects people from the present moment, and the present moment is the only place where real life actually exists. But most human beings rarely stay present for long. The mind keeps traveling backward, replaying old conversations, imagining different endings, thinking, I should have said this, I should have done that, why did this happen to me? And through endless repetition, the emotional wound stays alive. This is why some people continue suffering over moments that happened 10 or 20 years ago, not because the event itself still exists, but because the mind continues feeding emotional energy into it every day. The Vedas explained that memory itself is not the enemy. Memory becomes dangerous only when awareness becomes trapped inside it, because memories are meant to pass through consciousness, not become permanent prisons inside it. But the ego becomes attached to emotional pain because pain strengthens identity. Some people no longer know themselves without their wounds. Their suffering became familiar, and familiar pain often feels safer to the mind than unknown peace. That is why healing feels uncomfortable at first, because healing requires loosening attachment to the old self built around suffering. The old identity begins weakening, and the ego fears disappearing. But the Vedas taught something incredibly powerful. You are not every memory your mind carries. You are not every painful moment that happened to you. You are not every emotional scar from the past. Those experiences passed through your life, but they are not the deepest truth of who you are. Awareness itself still exists beneath all of it, untouched, watching silently, waiting patiently beneath the mental noise. And the moment you begin observing the past, instead of unconsciously reliving it, something begins changing internally. Space appears between awareness and memory. You start noticing how often the mind pulls you backward automatically. You start realizing how many fears were created from old emotional experiences. You begin seeing that the past has been quietly controlling your present decisions for years. And in that awareness, the prison weakens slightly, not because the memories disappear instantly, but because you stop worshipping them as your identity. For the first time, you begin understanding that the past only survives through continuous attachment. And once awareness stops feeding the old emotional patterns endlessly, something beautiful slowly becomes possible. The mind becomes lighter, the heart becomes softer, life becomes visible again, beyond old pain. Because beneath all the memories, beneath all the emotional scars, beneath all the mental repetition, there is still a deeper part of you untouched by everything that happened. A quieter awareness that was never broken by the past. And reconnecting with that awareness is the beginning of true inner freedom. Most of the thoughts controlling you were never chosen by you. One of the most shocking realizations a human being can experience is understanding that most thoughts inside the mind were never consciously chosen. They simply appear. A fearful thought appears. An angry thought appears. An insecure thought appears. A painful memory appears. A strange desire appears. A sudden wave of anxiety appears. And most of the time, people immediately believe these thoughts without questioning them. The mind says, "You are not enough," and the person believes it. The mind says, "Something bad is about to happen," and the body immediately reacts with fear. The mind says, "They probably do not care about you anymore," and suddenly sadness takes over emotionally. This happens every single day in millions of human minds. Thoughts appear automatically, and people obey them automatically. The Vedas understood this deeply. They taught that the uncontrolled mind behaves like restless wind moving endlessly in every direction, always active, always noisy, always reacting. The mind keeps producing thoughts continuously, whether they are true or false. But most people never learn how to observe thought itself, so they spend their entire lives trapped inside mental noise. And after enough years, they begin confusing the voice in their head with their actual identity. But the Vedas asked a profound question. If you can observe your thoughts, then who is the one observing them? Because there is a huge difference between a thought appearing and awareness noticing the thought appear. Most people never notice this separation. They instantly merge with whatever the mind says. If anger appears, they become anger. If fear appears, they become fear. If insecurity appears, they become insecurity. The thought controls perception completely. And this is how the prison keeps its power, not by forcing thoughts into the mind, but by making people identify with every thought automatically. The strange thing is this: many thoughts are not even original. They are conditioning. Old fears repeated so many times they started feeling true. Voices from childhood, opinions from society, emotional wounds from past experiences, messages absorbed from family, culture, social media, painful relationships, and repeated memories. Over time, these mental patterns become automatic. A child repeatedly criticized may grow into an adult whose mind constantly attacks them internally. A person repeatedly rejected may develop thoughts constantly expecting abandonment. A person raised around fear may develop a mind that imagines danger everywhere, and eventually, the person begins believing, "This is just my personality." But the Vedas taught that many mental patterns are simply conditioning repeated unconsciously for years, not the deepest truth of who you are. The mind becomes programmed through repetition. Whatever is repeated long enough begins shaping perception. This is why fearful thoughts become stronger when fed continuously. This is why insecurity grows when constantly believed. This is why overthinking becomes addictive. The mind strengthens whatever awareness repeatedly gives energy to, And because most people never question their thoughts, the prison continues expanding internally. A person can destroy their own peace entirely through thought alone. Nothing external needs to happen. One negative thought creates another, then another, then another. Soon the mind creates an entire emotional storm from imagination. The body reacts as if danger is real. Stress increases, the heart races, peace disappears. Even though externally, nothing may actually be wrong. The Vedas warned that unconscious thought creates suffering, because people mistake mental movement for reality itself. They forget thoughts are temporary appearances inside awareness, not absolute truth. This is why two people can experience the exact same situation but think completely differently about it. One person sees failure and gives up. Another sees a lesson and grows stronger. One person experiences rejection and feels worthless. Another experiences rejection and understands that life continues moving. The difference is not always the event itself. The difference is the relationship with thought. The uncontrolled mind creates endless stories automatically, and most of those stories are built from fear, insecurity, memory, and emotional conditioning. But because people never step back and observe the process, they remain hypnotized by the mental narrative. The Vedas taught that awareness itself remains untouched beneath all this mental activity. Thoughts come and go constantly, but awareness remains watching silently. The same awareness that existed when you were a child still exists now. Thoughts changed thousands of times over the years. Emotions changed, opinions changed, fears changed, yet awareness remained present through all of it. This means something incredibly important. You cannot be every thought appearing inside your mind, because thoughts are temporary. But awareness remains, and the moment a person truly realizes this, the prison begins weakening from the inside. For the first time, space appears between awareness and thought. Instead of instantly believing fear, you begin observing fear. Instead of becoming consumed by anger, you begin witnessing anger arise. Instead of drowning inside insecurity, you begin noticing the mind creating insecurity. This changes everything, because unconsciousness is what gives thought its power. The moment awareness enters the process, the spell starts breaking. A fearful thought may still appear, but now there is distance, now there is observation, now there is the possibility of freedom. The Vedas taught that inner freedom does not come from forcefully stopping every thought. That only creates more conflict. Freedom begins when awareness stops becoming completely identified with mental noise. Thoughts continue moving like clouds across the sky, but awareness no longer chases every cloud. This is why silence feels so different after deep observation begins. The mind may still produce thoughts, but they no longer feel like absolute rulers controlling consciousness completely. And slowly, the inner world becomes lighter, because people finally realize they do not need to obey every thought passing through the mind. Not every fear is truth. Not every insecurity is reality. Not every emotional impulse deserves control over your life. Many thoughts are simply old conditioning repeating itself automatically. And once this becomes visible, the prison loses one of its greatest powers, the power of unconscious belief. For the first time, a person begins experiencing moments beyond endless mental control, moments of stillness, moments of clarity, moments where awareness quietly exists without being dragged by every thought. And in those moments, something extraordinary begins revealing itself, a deeper self untouched by mental chaos, a silent awareness that was never truly trapped inside the prison of thought at all. The world strengthens the illusion before you even notice it. Most people believe the prison inside the mind was created only by personal fear and personal suffering. But the Vedas warned that the illusion becomes far stronger because the entire world quietly feeds it every single day. From childhood, human beings are trained to look outward constantly. You are taught how to compete, how to succeed, how to impress people, how to gain approval, how to become somebody in the eyes of the world. But very few people are taught how to understand their own consciousness. Very few are taught how to sit quietly with their thoughts. Very few are taught how the mind creates suffering internally. So people grow older, but remain strangers to themselves. The world teaches people how to build careers, but not how to build inner peace. It teaches people how to chase achievement, but not how to understand awareness. And slowly, without realizing it, human beings become emotionally trapped inside systems built entirely around distraction, comparison, and endless stimulation. The Vedas understood something deeply important. A distracted mind is easier to control because distraction keeps awareness asleep. The modern world constantly pulls attention outward. Noise everywhere, information everywhere, entertainment everywhere, opinions everywhere, comparison everywhere. The mind rarely gets a moment of silence anymore. And because silence disappears, self-awareness disappears with it. People become so busy reacting to the outside world that they never stop long enough to observe the chaos inside themselves. This is why so many people secretly feel empty even while appearing successful externally. Their outer life may look complete, but internally they feel disconnected from peace. Because external success cannot heal inner unconsciousness, the world keeps teaching people to search for happiness in external things. More money, more status, more beauty, more attention, more followers, more validation. And after hearing these messages repeatedly for years, people begin building identity around them. A person starts believing their worth depends on achievement. Another believes their value depends on appearance. Another believes they matter only when others approve of them. And eventually, human beings become emotionally controlled by external conditions they cannot fully control. This creates enormous suffering because the world constantly changes, attention fades, beauty changes, success rises and falls, people leave, opinions change. Yet the mind keeps trying to build permanent peace from temporary things. The Vedas warned that this creates a life filled with restlessness because the soul was never designed to survive only on external validation. But society rewards the ego constantly. People are praised for performance, praised for status, praised for appearance, praised for power. Very rarely are people praised for inner stillness, for awareness, for emotional balance, for wisdom, for peace. So humanity slowly drifts further away from itself, and the illusion becomes stronger. People begin performing identities instead of living naturally. Everyone becomes afraid of being left behind. Afraid of appearing unsuccessful, afraid of appearing unimportant, afraid of appearing ordinary. Social comparison quietly becomes emotional poison. The mind constantly asks, am I doing enough? Am I successful enough? Am I attractive enough? Am I important enough? Am I falling behind everyone else? And because comparison never truly ends, the mind never rests. The Vedas taught that the ego survives through comparison because comparison strengthens separation. The moment you compare yourself constantly, you stop experiencing life directly. Now you are measuring your existence through the eyes of others, and this creates deep inner suffering. A person may achieve something beautiful, yet still feel unhappy because someone else appears more successful. A person may have a peaceful life, yet still feel incomplete because society glorifies chaos and endless ambition. A person may already possess enough, yet continue suffering because comparison convinces them they are lacking something. The world strengthens the prison by teaching people that they are never enough as they are, never successful enough, never attractive enough, never wealthy enough, never admired enough. And because these standards constantly change, people spend their entire lives chasing approval that never fully satisfies the soul. The Vedas warned that unconscious society creates unconscious people. People inherit fears from others. They inherit emotional patterns from others. They inherit desires from others. They inherit insecurity from others. Without questioning anything deeply, the world tells you what to fear, what to chase, what to value, what to desire. And after hearing the same messages repeatedly, People begin confusing conditioning with truth. This is why many people no longer know what they genuinely want internally. Their minds became filled with voices from society, voices telling them what success should look like, what happiness should look like, what beauty should look like, what a meaningful life should look like. And beneath all that noise, their real self becomes harder and harder to hear. The Vedas taught that one of the greatest tragedies of human life is forgetting your deeper nature while chasing temporary illusions created by the world. Because eventually, people become emotionally exhausted from constantly trying to maintain an image, always performing, always comparing, always proving, always chasing. Yet deep inside, the soul quietly longs for something much simpler: stillness, truth, freedom from endless psychological pressure. This is why many people secretly crave silence without understanding why. Why peaceful nature feels healing. Why watching the ocean calms the mind. Why sitting quietly under the night sky sometimes feels strangely emotional. Because for brief moments, the noise of the world weakens. The endless pressure disappears temporarily, and awareness begins reconnecting with something deeper than social identity, something older than conditioning. The Vedas taught that awakening begins when a person starts seeing through the illusion society continuously reinforces, not by hating the world, not by escaping life completely, but by no longer allowing external conditioning to define inner peace. The awakened person may still live in the same world, work in the same world, interact with society normally, but internally, they are no longer hypnotized by it. They stop measuring their worth through comparison. They stop worshipping approval. They stop building identity entirely around status and performance. And slowly, something extraordinary begins happening. The prison weakens, because the world only controls the mind completely when awareness remains asleep. But the moment awareness begins waking up, the illusion no longer feels as powerful as it once did. For the first time, a person begins seeing clearly how much of their suffering was inherited unconsciously from the world around them. And beyond all the noise, all the pressure, all the comparison, they begin discovering a quieter truth hidden beneath it all. A deeper awareness, untouched by society's endless illusions. Overthinking is the mind's endless war against uncertainty. The human mind has a deep obsession with control. It wants certainty. It wants guarantees. It wants to know what will happen before life even unfolds. And because life itself is unpredictable, the mind begins fighting reality constantly. This inner fight is what most people call overthinking. The Vedas understood that overthinking is not simply thinking too much. It is the mind trying to create emotional safety in a world where nothing stays completely certain. The mind keeps asking endless questions. What if things go wrong? What if I fail? What if they leave me? What if I embarrass myself? What if the future becomes painful? What if I lose everything? And because the mind cannot fully answer these questions, it keeps spinning endlessly, again and again, the same thoughts, the same fears, the same imagined scenarios repeating inside consciousness like an endless loop. Most people believe overthinking is helping them prepare for life, but most of the time, overthinking only creates suffering before suffering even exists. A person lies awake at night, imagining conversations that never happen. They mentally replay future disasters repeatedly. Their body becomes anxious, their heart feels heavy, their peace disappears. Even though externally, nothing dangerous may actually be happening, the Vedas warned that the uncontrolled mind suffers more from imagination than from reality itself, because the mind constantly projects fearful futures onto the screen of consciousness, and the body reacts as if those futures are already real. This is why overthinking feels so exhausting. The nervous system never fully rests. The mind keeps preparing for emotional danger constantly, always analyzing, always predicting, always worrying, always searching for certainty. And slowly, people become trapped inside their own mental activity, The strangest part is this: overthinking often disguises itself as intelligence. People believe, if I think enough, I will finally feel safe. But safety never fully arrives, because uncertainty is part of existence itself. Life changes constantly. People change. Situations change. Relationships change. The future changes. Yet the mind refuses to accept this reality completely. It keeps trying to control what cannot fully be controlled, and this creates endless inner conflict. The Vedas taught that suffering increases whenever the mind resists the natural movement of life, because life flows, but the mind tries to freeze outcomes. It wants guarantees from relationships, guarantees from success, guarantees from the future. And when life refuses to provide complete certainty, the mind becomes restless. This is why overthinking often becomes strongest during moments of uncertainty, when someone pulls away emotionally, when the future feels unclear, when life enters transition, when control begins disappearing. The mind panics internally because uncertainty threatens the ego's illusion of control, and instead of relaxing into the unknown, the mind begins mentally fighting it. This fight creates enormous suffering. A person can physically sit in complete silence, yet internally feel trapped inside non-stop noise. One fearful thought appears, then another follows, then another. Soon the mind creates an entire emotional storm from imagination alone. The Vedas explained that the mind survives through movement. It constantly jumps between past and future, regret about yesterday, fear about tomorrow. But very rarely does it remain fully present, because presence weakens the ego's control. In the present moment, most psychological suffering temporarily disappears. Right now, in this exact moment, many of the fears created by the mind are not actually happening, but the mind keeps leaving the present moment searching for problems, searching for threats, searching for uncertainty, searching for ways to regain control. And because the search never ends, inner peace disappears. This is why people can overthink even beautiful moments. A loving relationship becomes fear of losing the person. Success becomes fear of failure returning. Happiness becomes fear that it will not last. The mind struggles to simply experience life openly. It constantly tries to emotionally secure the future, but the future remains unknowable, and deep down, this truth terrifies the ego. The Vedas taught that the mind fears uncertainty because uncertainty reminds it that control is temporary. The ego wants permanence, but existence itself is constantly changing. This creates enormous tension inside human consciousness. The mind says, everything must stay predictable for me to feel safe. But life says, everything changes, and the battle between those two realities creates overthinking. This is why some people mentally exhaust themselves every single day. Their minds never stop working. Even when the body rests, the mind keeps running, thinking, analyzing, imagining, predicting, and after enough years, people begin believing this constant mental tension is normal. They forget what inner stillness even feels like. The Vedas warned that overthinking disconnects people from life itself, because when the mind becomes obsessed with imagined futures, it stops experiencing the present moment fully. A person may sit beside people they love, yet mentally remain somewhere else, lost in fear, lost in prediction, lost in anxiety about tomorrow. And slowly, life passes while the mind remains trapped inside psychological noise. The saddest part is this: most overthinking does not actually protect people from pain. It only forces them to suffer before pain even arrives. Sometimes pain never arrives at all, yet the mind already suffered for weeks, months, or years imagining it. The Vedas taught that true peace does not come from controlling the future perfectly. True peace begins when awareness stops demanding certainty from life. This does not mean becoming careless. It means understanding something deeper. No amount of overthinking can fully control existence. No amount of anxiety can guarantee safety. No amount of mental rehearsal can stop life from changing. And once a person truly accepts this internally, something begins softening inside them. The mind slowly loses its addiction to endless control. For the first time, a person begins allowing life to move naturally instead of mentally fighting every uncertainty. And in that surrender, a different kind of intelligence appears, a quieter intelligence, not built from fear, not built from endless mental noise, but built from awareness itself. The Vedas taught that awareness can observe uncertainty without becoming destroyed by it, because awareness does not need complete control to remain present. The ego does. The mind does. But awareness itself remains still beneath all the chaos. And the moment a person reconnects with that deeper stillness, overthinking begins losing its power, not instantly, but slowly, moment by moment, thought by thought, until eventually, the mind no longer feels like a prison endlessly fighting reality. And for the first time in years, silence begins returning to the inner world again. Silence feels terrifying because the false self cannot survive there. Most people believe they are afraid of silence, but the Vedas taught something much deeper. People are not truly afraid of silence itself. They are afraid of what silence begins revealing when the noise finally disappears. This is why modern life has become completely filled with distraction, constant scrolling, constant entertainment, constant music, constant talking, constant stimulation. The mind always wants something to focus on externally, because the moment external distraction disappears, the internal world suddenly becomes visible. And for many people, that inner world feels overwhelming. The moment silence arrives, thoughts become louder, old memories return, hidden fears surface, emotional pain rises into awareness, restlessness becomes impossible to ignore. This is why so many people cannot sit alone quietly for long periods of time. The silence begins exposing things they spent years escaping through distraction. The Vedas understood this deeply. They taught that the false self survives through noise. The ego needs constant movement to maintain control. It needs distraction, comparison, entertainment, mental stimulation, endless thinking. Because when the mind finally becomes still, the illusion starts weakening, and this feels terrifying in the beginning. A person may sit alone in silence for only a few minutes, and suddenly feel uncomfortable internally. The body becomes restless. The mind immediately searches for escape. Pick up the phone, play music, open social media, message someone, turn on the television, anything to avoid sitting completely present with oneself. Why? Because silence removes distractions, and once distractions disappear, people finally begin hearing the chaos that was already living inside them the entire time. The Vedas taught that human beings often use the external world to avoid facing their internal world. Some people stay constantly busy because they fear being alone with their thoughts. Some constantly seek attention because silence makes them feel emotionally empty. Some keep chasing stimulation because stillness begins exposing unresolved pain. And slowly, distraction becomes emotional survival. This is why silence feels uncomfortable before it feels peaceful. At first, silence exposes the prison. You begin noticing how restless the mind actually is. You begin noticing how constantly the mind searches for stimulation. You begin noticing how addicted consciousness became to movement and noise. The Vedas compared the uncontrolled mind to a stormy ocean, waves moving endlessly in every direction. Thoughts never stopping, emotions constantly shifting, desires constantly appearing, and because most people live inside this storm every day, they no longer realize how noisy their inner world truly became. The noise feels normal until silence arrives. Then suddenly, the mental chaos becomes visible. A person may realize they cannot stay fully present even for a few moments. The mind instantly travels somewhere else, into the future, into the past, into fantasy, into fear, into memory, into worry. The Vedas taught that this constant mental movement disconnects people from awareness itself, because awareness exists only here, only now. But the mind rarely stays here for long. It escapes constantly, This is why silence feels threatening to the ego. Silence slows the movement of mental escape, and when escape becomes difficult, the false self begins losing power. The ego survives through constant identification with thought, but in silence, something strange begins happening. For brief moments, there are fewer thoughts, fewer distractions, and suddenly, awareness begins noticing itself. Not the personality, not the social identity, not the endless mental narration, just silent presence. This experience feels unfamiliar to the prison begins breaking the moment you observe the mind. Most people spend their entire lives completely lost inside the movement of the mind. The thought appears and they instantly follow it. An emotion appears and they instantly become consumed by it. Anger appears and they react automatically. Fear appears and they believe it automatically. Sadness appears and they drown inside it automatically. The process happens so fast that most human beings never stop long enough to observe what is actually happening inside them. They simply live on autopilot. The Vedas taught that this unconscious way of living is one of the deepest forms of imprisonment, because anything unconscious gains power over you. The mind keeps creating reactions, and awareness remains asleep inside the reactions. This is why people repeat the same emotional cycles for years, the same fears, the same patterns, the same destructive habits, the same suffering, not because freedom is impossible, but because the mind was never truly observed clearly. The Vedas explained that the moment awareness begins observing the mind consciously, something extraordinary starts happening. The prison weakens, not because thoughts disappear instantly, not because emotions suddenly vanish, but because awareness finally stops becoming completely hypnotized by them. This changes everything. For the first time, a small distance begins appearing between you and the mental chaos. Instead of instantly becoming anger, you begin noticing anger arise inside you. Instead of instantly drowning inside fear, you begin observing fear moving through the mind. Instead of instantly obeying insecurity, you begin watching the insecurity speak, and in that observation, the illusion starts losing power. Because unconscious identification is what feeds the prison. The moment awareness enters the process, the spell weakens. The Vedas compared this awakening to someone suddenly becoming aware inside a dream. Before awareness appears, everything feels completely real. Every fear feels absolute. Every emotion feels permanent. Every thought feels true. But the moment awareness awakens, something shifts internally. Now the person begins realizing, these are thoughts moving through the mind. These are emotions passing through consciousness. This is not the deepest truth of who I am, and that realization creates inner freedom, little by little. Most people think observation means controlling the mind aggressively, but the Vedas taught something much deeper. Observation is not force. It is witnessing, quietly watching, without immediately reacting, without immediately judging, without becoming lost inside every mental movement. This is why true awareness feels so peaceful, because awareness itself does not panic the way the ego does. Awareness simply sees. The mind says, you are failing. Awareness notices the thought. The mind says, something terrible is coming. Awareness notices fear appearing. The mind says, you are not enough. Awareness quietly watches the insecurity arise and pass. This changes the entire relationship with suffering, because now the person is no longer fully trapped inside every emotional storm. There is space, and inside that space, freedom begins growing. The Vedas taught that suffering becomes strongest when awareness disappears completely inside thought. When a person fully identifies with every mental movement, the prison feels absolute, but observation interrupts identification. This is why many people experience moments of clarity during silence, or while sitting alone in nature, or late at night when the noise slows down for a moment. Suddenly they become aware of their own mind. They notice how restless it has been, how repetitive it has been, how exhausting it has been, and for a brief moment, they stop blindly following every thought. That moment may seem small, but spiritually, it changes everything. because once awareness sees the prison clearly, it can never fully return to unconscious sleep the same way again. The Vedas taught that awakening does not happen through collecting information endlessly. It happens through direct observation of consciousness itself. You begin noticing how thoughts constantly pull you into the future. You begin noticing how memory constantly drags you into the past. You begin noticing how fear creates imagined suffering. You begin noticing how the ego seeks validation constantly. You begin noticing how desire keeps the mind restless endlessly. And slowly, through observation, the hidden mechanisms of the prison become visible. This is why awareness is so powerful. Because illusion survives through unconsciousness. The moment something becomes fully visible, it begins losing control over you. A person may still experience fear, but now they recognize fear as movement inside the mind. A person may still experience sadness, but now they understand sadness is temporary. A person may still experience anger, but now they can observe it before becoming consumed completely. This creates enormous transformation internally. For the first time, people stop reacting automatically to every impulse created by the mind. They stop allowing every emotion to control their behavior. They stop believing every negative thought as absolute truth. And slowly, a deeper calm begins appearing beneath the mental noise. The Vedas taught that awareness itself remains untouched beneath all psychological chaos. Thoughts move, emotions move, life changes constantly, but awareness remains present through all of it. The same awareness watching your mind right now is the same awareness that existed when you were a child. Thoughts changed thousands of times. Identities changed. Fears changed. Desires changed. Yet awareness remained. And the moment a person reconnects with that deeper awareness, the prison starts collapsing from the inside, not through violence, not through suppression, not through forcing the mind into silence, but through seeing clearly. This is why observation feels uncomfortable at first for many people, because when awareness becomes stronger, the illusion becomes visible. And sometimes what becomes visible is painful. You begin seeing how much fear controlled your life, how much energy was wasted overthinking, how many decisions came from insecurity, how much suffering was created by unconscious thought. But this discomfort is part of awakening, because truth often feels uncomfortable before it feels liberating. The Vedas taught that real transformation begins the moment a person becomes honest enough to observe themselves completely, without pretending, without escaping, without hiding behind distractions, just observing, watching the mind carefully, watching the ego carefully, watching emotional patterns carefully. And through this observation, something beautiful slowly happens. The mind loses its absolute authority. Thoughts continue appearing, but they no longer completely dominate awareness. Emotions continue moving, but they no longer fully imprison consciousness. The prison begins cracking, and through those cracks, a deeper peace begins entering the inner world, a peace that was always there beneath the noise, a stillness untouched by fear, desire, ego, and endless mental movement. And for the first time in a very long time, the person begins experiencing what true inner freedom actually feels like. True freedom begins the moment the illusion loses power over you. Most people spend their entire lives searching for freedom in the outside world. They believe freedom means having more money, more success, more control, more comfort, more approval, more power over circumstances. The mind keeps whispering, if life finally changes, then I will finally feel free. But the Vedas taught something completely different. They taught that true freedom does not begin outside you. It begins inside the moment the illusion created by the mind loses its control over awareness. Because a person can have external success and still remain internally imprisoned. A wealthy person can still live in fear. A famous person can still suffer from insecurity. A successful person can still feel empty. A person surrounded by comfort can still remain trapped inside endless overthinking. Why? Because the prison was never only external, it was psychological. The Vedas taught that the deepest form of suffering comes from unconscious identification with the mind, the constant belief that every thought is truth, every fear is reality, every emotion defines who you are. And once this illusion begins breaking, everything changes, not necessarily outside, but inside. The world may still continue moving, people may still come and go, life may still remain uncertain, pain may still visit sometimes, challenges may still appear, but internally, something becomes different. The mind no longer controls consciousness the same way it once did. Thoughts still appear, but they no longer dominate awareness completely. Fear still arises sometimes, but it no longer defines your entire existence. Emotions still move through the body, but they no longer imprison the soul. This is what the Vedas called liberation from illusion, not escaping life, not abandoning the world completely, but waking up from unconscious psychological attachment. For the first time, a person begins realizing they are not the endless noise inside their head. They are the awareness quietly witnessing it, and this realization creates a kind of peace that external success alone can never provide. Because now peace is no longer completely dependent on circumstances. Before awakening, peace disappears whenever life becomes difficult. A small problem destroys emotional balance. A painful opinion ruins the entire day. A moment of rejection creates enormous suffering. Why? Because the mind remains emotionally chained to external conditions. But when awareness deepens, inner stability slowly begins appearing. The Vedas taught that awareness itself remains untouched beneath all temporary experiences. Thoughts change constantly, emotions change constantly, situations change constantly, but awareness remains. Like the sky behind moving clouds, storms may appear, but the sky itself remains untouched. This is why awakened people often appear calmer even during difficult situations. Not because they never feel pain, but because they no longer become completely consumed by mental illusion. They understand something deeper. Everything passing through the mind is temporary. Fear is temporary. Anger is temporary. Sadness is temporary. Pleasure is temporary. Even identity itself is constantly changing. And once this truth becomes deeply understood, attachment begins weakening naturally. The ego loosens its grip. The endless need for control softens. The constant hunger for validation becomes quieter. And for the first time, life begins feeling lighter internally. The Vedas taught that freedom begins the moment a person stops searching for themselves entirely inside temporary things. Because most people build identity from things that constantly change: relationships, status, achievement, attention, appearance, opinions from others. But anything built on temporary foundations creates fear automatically. Because deep down, the mind knows all temporary things can disappear. This creates endless anxiety, endless attachment, endless emotional dependency. But awareness itself does not depend on these things to exist. Awareness remains present before success and after failure, before praise and after criticism, before gain and after loss. And the moment a person reconnects with that deeper awareness, something extraordinary happens. Life stops feeling like constant psychological warfare. The inner world becomes quieter, not perfectly silent all the time, but no longer controlled entirely by chaos. The Vedas explained that awakening is not becoming emotionally numb, it is becoming conscious. A conscious person still feels deeply, still loves deeply, still experiences sadness, still experiences joy. But internally, there is space around every experience. The person no longer drowns inside mental reactions automatically. This changes relationships completely, because now love no longer comes entirely from attachment and fear. It comes from presence. This changes suffering completely, because pain is no longer endlessly multiplied by mental resistance. This changes daily life completely, because the mind stops fighting reality every moment. The Vedas taught that most human suffering comes from resistance to what already exists. The mind says, This should not be happening. I cannot accept this. Life must go exactly how I imagined. And this resistance creates enormous inner tension, but awareness begins softening that resistance, not through weakness, through understanding. Understanding that life itself was never meant to remain perfectly controllable. Everything changes, everything moves, everything eventually passes. And once a person deeply accepts this truth internally, fear begins losing its power. The desperate need to control everything begins fading. The soul finally begins breathing again. This is why awakened people often seem peaceful in simple moments, watching the sky, sitting quietly, walking slowly, listening deeply, because they are no longer completely trapped inside endless psychological noise. For the first time, they are actually present. The Vedas taught that true freedom is not becoming someone new. It is remembering what existed before the illusion took control, before fear shaped identity, before society filled the mind with endless conditioning, before the ego built psychological walls around awareness. Beneath all the noise, there was always something deeper, a silent awareness, untouched by fear, untouched by comparison, untouched by endless craving, untouched by mental chaos. The prison only felt permanent because consciousness forgot its deeper nature. But the moment awareness begins waking up, the walls slowly begin disappearing. And perhaps this is the greatest truth hidden inside the Vedas. You were never truly the prison. You were only the awareness trapped inside it for a while. And the moment you finally see the illusion clearly, the journey back to inner freedom quietly begins. And maybe that is the strangest truth of all. The prison was never built with iron bars. It was built from thoughts you never questioned, fears you kept obeying, memories you kept replaying, desires that kept pulling you away from yourself. And after enough years, the illusion became so familiar that you stopped noticing you were living inside it. You called it personality. You called it stress. You called it, this is just who I am. But somewhere beneath all the noise, there was always another part of you quietly watching. A silent awareness untouched by fear, untouched by overthinking, untouched by the endless chaos of the mind. The Vedas tried to remind humanity of this thousands of years ago, not to make people escape life, but to help them finally see it clearly. Because true freedom does not begin when the world changes. It begins the moment you stop believing every thought inside your head. It begins the moment you observe the mind instead of becoming trapped inside it. It begins the moment silence no longer feels empty, but peaceful. And maybe tonight, for the first time in a very long time, you are beginning to notice something. The voice inside your head is always changing. The emotions are always changing. The fears are always changing. But something inside you has been quietly present through all of it, watching, waiting, unmoving beneath the storm. And perhaps that silent awareness is who you truly were all along. Not the prison, not the illusion, but the consciousness that finally became aware of it. So before you leave this video, take one slow breath and ask yourself honestly, if the mind has been creating the prison all this time, then who is the one finally seeing the walls?